No, please no. The choked whisper sliced through the relentless curtain of rain, raw with a terror that stopped Julian Hayes cold. Beneath the flickering streetlight, a figure small and lost in sodden rags recoiled deeper into the shadowed doorway. As those haunted eyes, wide with a desperate plea for invisibility, met his recognition, struck Julian like a physical blow. Years vanished. The city, the rain, his entire, carefully constructed life, all faded. Ellie. The name was a breath, an agony, a ghost on his lips. Eleanor Vance. Is that truly you? Her only answer was a panicked scramble to flee, to melt back into the unforgiving night that had clearly become her only refuge. What could Julian possibly do in the face of such desperation? And could a love buried so deep beneath layers of pain ever find its way back to the light? To witness every moment of their unbelievable journey and share your own thoughts as this profound story unfolds, make sure you're with us for what comes next. The city's relentless rhythm usually sang Julian Hayes, a lullaby of ambition and achievement, each beat a testament to the empire he had meticulously built. Tonight, however, the symphony was jarring a hollow echo against the backdrop of another gilded charity gala he'd just navigated. He loosened his tie, the silk a constricting reminder of a world that felt increasingly like a beautifully crafted empty stage. He often mused with a private, weary smile that the most predictable thing in his life was the astonishing lack of genuine surprise at these events. Another million pledged another round of polite applause, another night where the reflections in the crystal glasses seemed more animated than the conversations. Rain had begun to fall, a soft, insistent drizzle that an hour ago was a distant threat. Now a silver veil over Manhattan's late-night streets. Julian had dismissed his driver, a rare impulse for solitude, pulling him towards a longer, less direct route to his penthouse. He found a strange comfort in the anonymity of the wet pavements, the way the city lights fractured and bled across the slick asphalt. It was on such a night under the flickering neon sign of a closed diner in a forgotten alcove of the city that his world tilted on its axis. Huddled in a recessed doorway, a figure sought meager shelter from the persistent downpour. It was a scene Julian had passed countless times, a fleeting moment of discomfort, perhaps a quickly offered bill, then forgotten. But something about this small, hunched form, wrapped in what looked like a threadbare blanket, held his gaze. He slowed an inexplicable pull in his chest, a dissonance against the practiced indifference city life often demanded. As he drew nearer, the dim light caught a sliver of a face, mostly obscured by a tangle of damp, matted hair. And then a hand, thin and trembling, emerged to pull the covering tighter. Julian stopped. His breath hitched. Every meticulously constructed wall around his heart seemed to crack. Time recoiled, years peeling away like old paint, exposing a memory so vivid, so cherished it ached. It couldn't be. Yet the curve of that cheekbone, the delicate line of the temple, even shadowed and gaunt, were imprinted on his soul. He took another hesitant step, his polished shoes silent on the rain-slicked ground. "Excuse me." His voice was rougher, more uncertain than he'd heard it in years. The figure flinched, a small wounded animal, startled by a predator. Slowly she looked up. And in the dim, unforgiving light, Julian Hayes stared into eyes that had once been the brightest stars in his young universe. They were dull now, haunted, filled with a weariness that settled like a stone in his own gut. But they were unmistakably hers. Eleanor, Ellie Vance, his Ellie, the girl who had shared his childhood dreams, his first clumsy, heartfelt confessions of love before vanishing from his life like a whisper. The shock was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. "Ellie," Here. Like this. The vibrant, laughing girl he remembered was lost beneath layers of hardship. Her clothes ragged her skin, etched with a story of suffering he couldn't begin to comprehend. Ellie's eyes widened, a flicker of stunned recognition warring with a deeper, more profound fear. She scrambled back, pushing herself further into the inadequate shelter of the doorway, a choked sound escaping her lips. No. Julian, it can't be you. Her voice was a fragile rasp, broken by disbelief and a shame so potent it was almost a tangible force. She tried to turn away, to hide, to disappear back into the shadows that had become her world. Ellie, wait, Julian managed his own voice, thick with a storm of emotions. Disbelief, anguish, a fierce, protective surge. He saw her instinct to flee the raw panic in her gaze. He knew one wrong move, one word too forceful, and she would bolt lost to him, again, perhaps forever. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace, of non-threat. Please, Ellie. It's me. I just want to help. Her laugh was a brittle, painful sound. Help, look at me, Julian. There's no helping this. She gestured vaguely at herself, at the damp concrete that was her bed. He had to tread carefully. The successful businessman in him, the one who closed multi-million-dollar deals with unshakable confidence, was gone. In his place stood a man confronting a ghost from his heart's deepest archive, a ghost now made of flesh and bone and unbearable sorrow. Let me, he said, his voice softer now, imbued with a sincerity he hoped could pierce through her despair. Just for tonight, Ellie. No questions, I promise. A warm room, a proper meal, dry clothes. He saw the immediate suspicion in her eyes, the ingrained distrust of someone who had clearly known too much cruelty. He quickly added, I know a place, a small private guest house. Very discreet. They help people who need a safe space. He was thinking of a small charity he supported, one that offered emergency shelter with dignity. I can call ahead. You won't even have to see me after I get you there if you don't want to. He reached into his pocket, not for his wallet, but for his phone. Here, he said, holding it out. This is a new burner phone, untraceable. It's charged. My number is the only one in it. If you change your mind, if you need anything, even if you just want to talk, you can call. No pressure. Ever. She stared at the phone, then at his face, her expression a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and perhaps the faintest, most fragile glimmer of something that might have once been hope. The rain continued its steady rhythm, a mournful soundtrack to this impossible reunion. Julian waited, his heart pounding, knowing that this moment, this single precarious interaction, was the most important negotiation of his life. He could see the battle raging within her, the instinct to protect herself against more pain versus the desperate human need for a lifeline. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ellie gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it wasn't a rejection either. It was a flicker, a fragile opening, a profound sense of relief mingled with a deep, aching sorrow for what she must have endured, washed over Julian. He knew this was only the first step on an unknown, undoubtedly difficult path. What horrors had led Eleanor Vance, his bright-spirited Ellie, to this desolate doorway? The question burned in his mind, a silent promise forming alongside it. He would find out. And somehow, in some way, he would try to help her reclaim the light that life had so cruelly tried to extinguish. He just prayed she would let him. The guest house Julian had found for Ellie was a quiet sanctuary, a world away from the relentless city and the doorway that had been her prison. He kept his promise, visiting briefly each day, bringing not questions, but small comforts. A book of poetry. She once loved a particular brand of tea. He vaguely remembered her mentioning decades ago fresh flowers that added a touch of fragile life to the simple room. He never stayed long, mindful of her need for space, for the slow thawing of a trust long frozen by hardship. He simply listened his presence, a steady, undemanding anchor. Days bled into a week. Ellie spoke little at first, her words hesitant, like fledgling birds testing their wings. She ate, she slept in the safety of a locked room, and slowly the haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness, but also a flicker of awareness of presence. The dam finally broke on a grey afternoon, the kind that mirrors an unsettled soul. Julian had found her staring out the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the damp garden. A sudden violent shudder ran through her, and when she turned to him, her eyes were wide raw with a terror that seemed to emanate from a place beyond the present moment. I had a dream, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Or a memory. It's all so jumbled now. Julian pulled a chair closer, his movements calm, patient. Tell me, Ellie, if you want to. And so the story spilled out, a torrent of pain, held back for too long. It was a litany of betrayals, each one a fresh wound. She spoke of a man named Marcus, a charming, persuasive artist who had captured her heart years after she and Julian had drifted apart. He had painted a future for them, in brilliant, intoxicating colors, a future built on her modest inheritance after her parents passed. He made me feel seen, she said, a bitter twist to her lips. For a while. The vibrant canvases had soon faded, revealing a conman's cruel design. Marcus, with chilling precision, had siphoned away her money, her home, her self-respect, leaving her entangled in debts and accusations she didn't understand. He'd vanished, leaving her to face the wreckage. She'd tried to fight to find work, but shame, and a system that often overlooked the fallen, had pushed her further to the margins. One misfortune had cascaded into another. An eviction, a stolen bag containing her last few dollars, and identification, the descent into the numbing anonymity of the streets. She glossed over the darkest parts, the daily humiliations, the constant fear, but Julian could read them in the shadows that flickered across her face, in the clenching of her fists. "I became invisible, Julian," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "And then, being invisible was safer. Until you saw me." Julian listened, his heart, a heavy, aching drum in his chest. The urbane composure he usually wore was stripped away, leaving only a raw, profound empathy and a burning anger at the injustice of it all. He wanted to rage, to hunt down this Marcus, but he knew Ellie needed something else from him now. She needed to be heard, to be validated, to know she wasn't alone in her remembered hell. When she finished, a fragile silence filled the room, broken only by her quiet, exhausted sobs. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply reached out, and after a moment's hesitation, gently took her hand. It was cold, trembling, but she didn't pull away. Meanwhile, across town, in the sleek, minimalist offices of Marlowe Holdings, Serafina, Marlowe was aware of a shift in Julian Hayes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to most, but Serafina prided herself on her perceptiveness, especially when it came to Julian. Their relationship, a carefully curated dance of convenience, ambition, and a certain detached affection, had always operated on unspoken rules. Lately, Julian was distracted, preoccupied. There was a new depth in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a certain emotional resonance that wasn't directed at her. Her inquiries had been discreet, leveraging a network of contacts that valued her influence as much as she valued their information. A woman, destitute apparently, someone Julian had known a long time ago. Serafina's perfectly sculpted lips thinned, A charity case, or something more. Whatever it was an unknown variable, and Serafina Marlowe did not appreciate variables that could upset her meticulously planned trajectory. A trajectory that had Julian Hayes playing a significant, if not entirely romantic role. A file thin but growing began to take shape on her secure server, labeled simply E. Vance. Julian met his old friend Daniel Walker. Later that week at a quiet bar, they favored the kind where conversations could unfold without interruption. Daniel, a successful architect with a quick wit and an even quicker mind, raised an eyebrow as Julian recounted a carefully edited version of Ellie's situation. So Daniel began swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The Julian Hayes captain of industry, master of the universe, is now personally overseeing a philanthropic endeavor of a rather singular nature. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. Another lost kitten you've decided to adopt, Julian. Though this one sounds like she's been through a lion's den. Julian managed a wry smile. Something like that, Dan. But this is different. They always are. Daniel said, though his tone softened. All right, I'm listening. What inferno did this old friend of yours walk through? Julian didn't share the raw details of Ellie's confession. That was hers to hold. But he outlined enough for Daniel to understand the gravity. She's been through hell, Dan, and she's one of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever known. She just needs a hand up, a real one. And you, a man who usually delegates the handing of anything less than a 9-figure contract, are offering it personally, Daniel observed, his gaze astute. She must have been quite the childhood sweetheart. Julian didn't confirm or deny, just looked at his friend. I was thinking, your firm. You mentioned needing someone organized, good, with people for that new community outreach program you're launching. Reception, admin, something to get her started. She's bright, Daniel. She always was. Daniel leaned back, considering. It's not a token position, Julian. She'd have to be capable, she, as Julian said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. She just needs the chance to prove it again to herself, as much as anyone. Daniel nodded slowly. All right. Have her send me her resume, or whatever she has. We can talk. No promises, but I'll see what we can do. And Julian, yeah, this Ellie. Tread carefully, my friend. Sounds like you're walking into a minefield of old emotions with this one. Julian knew Daniel was right, but retreat wasn't an option. Later that evening, he broached the subject with Ellie, gently suggesting the possibility of a job with Daniel's firm, and even more delicately, the idea of speaking with a professional, a therapist specializing in trauma. Just to help you sort through things, Ellie, he'd said. To have someone neutral to talk to someone who understands what you've navigated. He saw the familiar fear flicker in her eyes, the instinct to withdraw. But then something else emerged, a spark of the old Eleanor Vance, the girl who had never backed down from a challenge, a weary resolve. Maybe, she'd said, her voice quiet but firm, maybe it's time I started navigating out. Julian felt a surge of hope. It was a fragile beginning, a single step on a precipitous path, but for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, he saw a flicker of dawn in Ellie's eyes. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would walk that path with her, no matter where it led. The first few weeks at Daniel Walker's architectural firm were a whirlwind for Eleanor Vance. The modern office, with its gleaming surfaces and hushed efficiency, felt like another planet compared to the stark realities she had recently escaped. There were moments of fumbling, a blush-inducing battle with the high-tech coffee machine that Daniel, with a good-natured chuckle, had declared, Careful Eleanor that one's got a PhD in stubbornness, only responds to advanced bribery, usually in the form of premium beans. Ellie had laughed, a genuine light sound that surprised even herself. I think my caffeine negotiation skills are a bit rusty, she'd admitted, a small, self-deprecating smile playing on her lips. But beneath the initial awkwardness, a forgotten sense of competence began to stir. She was organized, meticulous, and her innate warmth, once unburied from layers of trauma, made her a natural at handling clients and coordinating schedules. The routine, the small daily tasks accomplished the simple dignity of earning a paycheck. Each was a small stitch mending the tattered fabric of her self-esteem. Her therapy sessions, too, were carving paths through the dense fog of her past, allowing flickers of clarity where before there had only been suffocating darkness. It was during one quiet evening, sorting through the few meager possessions Julian had managed to retrieve for her from a homeless shelter's lost and found, items she'd clung to through instinct rather than any real hope, that the first tremor of a new, unsettling truth emerged. Most of it was just worn-out clothing, a tattered book, but there was also a small, water-stained notebook, one she'd used in the early days with Marcus. She'd almost thrown it away, wanting to purge every reminder of him. Flipping through its pages, idly filled mostly with old shopping lists and forgotten appointments, a name caught her eye, scribbled in Marcus's flamboyant hand on a page listing expenses he'd claimed were for a gallery showing. The name wasn't his. It was R. Sterling, next to a notation, Logistics, AP Import, Export. It meant nothing to her at the time, just another of Marcus's opaque dealings. But now, with a mind slowly clearing, a mind no longer hazed by romantic delusion or daily terror, the name snagged. R. Sterling, AP Import, Export. A chill snaked down her spine. She remembered Marcus mentioning an investor, a silent partner in some vague overseas venture he was always cagey about. He'd once taken a call, his voice hushed, deferential, a stark contrast to his usual confident bluster. He'd mentioned Sterling's shipment being delayed. At the time, Ellie had dismissed it. Now a different, more sinister pattern began to form in her thoughts. Marcus was a con artist, yes, but was he working alone? Or was he a pawn, a disposable tool for someone far more powerful, far more dangerous? This AP Import, Export. What if it wasn't about art supplies? Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This wasn't just about her stolen inheritance anymore. This felt bigger, darker. She thought of Julian, of the fragile new life she was tentatively building. Was she dragging him into something far more perilous than either of them had imagined? She wrestled with it for a day, the secret coiling in her stomach. But the tentative trust Julian had so patiently cultivated held firm. He had listened to her darkest truths without flinching. She had to tell him. When she finally did, her voice trembling as she laid out the flimsy notebook on the coffee table in his spacious, quiet apartment, Julian listened with an unnerving stillness. He examined the faded ink, his brow furrowed in concentration. R. Sterling, he murmured. AP, Import, Export. The names clearly meant nothing to him either initially. It might be nothing, Julian, Ellie said, twisting her hands in her lap. Just me. Overthinking. But the way Marcus was, sometimes he seemed almost scared. And this company? I did a quick search. It has a very small, very vague online presence, almost too clean. Julian looked up, his eyes, sharp, a new kind of alertness in them. He wasn't just the compassionate friend now, the astute businessman, the man who understood the undercurrents of power and deceit, was engaged. No, Ellie, he said slowly. You're not overthinking. Your instincts are telling you something. And after everything Marcus put you through, we don't ignore those instincts. A wave of relief, so potent it almost made her dizzy, washed over Ellie. He believed her. He wasn't dismissing her fears as paranoia born of trauma. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice small. Julian leaned forward. "We find out who R. Sterling is, and what AP import-export really does." A determined glint appeared in his eyes. "I have a few contacts. People who specialize in looking into things that prefer to stay hidden." He paused then. A faint, almost boyish smile touched his lips. "Think of it as research for your peace of mind and mine." And so began their unlikely clandestine investigation. Julian, with his resources, engaged a discreet private investigator, known for untangling complex corporate webs. Ellie, with her sharp memory for details she hadn't even realized she'd retained, provided crucial context. They met in quiet cafes, poring over preliminary findings, scraps of information that slowly began to form a disturbing mosaic. There were moments of levity, brief and unexpected. Once, while trying to decipher a particularly convoluted financial report the investigator had unearthed, Julian had sighed dramatically, running a hand through his hair. "I face hostile takeovers with less trepidation than I do this. I think I'd rather negotiate with a room full of sharks." Ellie had actually chuckled. "Well, Mr. Hayes," she'd said, a spark of her old playful spirit glinting in her eyes, "you're surprisingly good at playing detective for a man who usually commands a boardroom. Though perhaps we should leave the actual tailing of suspects to the professionals. I'm not sure your bespoke suit is quite cut out for lurking in alleyways." Julian had looked down at his immaculate attire, and then back at her, a genuine laugh escaping him. "Point taken, Miss Vance. My alleyway lurking days are perhaps best left in my imagination." The shared laughter, however brief, was a balm, a testament to the deepening bond between them, a bond forged not just in shared history, but in present purpose. Yet beneath the surface, the tension mounted with each new piece of information. AP Import-Export was indeed a shell company with tendrils reaching into murky international waters. And R. Sterling, though elusive, was beginning to sound less like a legitimate businessman and more like a phantom, a name whispered in connection with activities that thrived in the deepest shadows. The light-heartedness of their detective work couldn't entirely mask the growing unease. They were pulling at a thread, and they had no idea what monster it might be attached to. The investigator Julian had hired a meticulous former financial fraud detective named Peterson, was like a bloodhound on a cold trail. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to unravel the tangled threads of AP Import, Export, and the elusive R. Sterling. The company was a ghost, a series of post office boxes and shell corporations that snaked through offshore havens. But Peterson found a pattern. Its brief, profitable activities often coincided with a string of failed businesses whose assets were mysteriously acquired for pennies on the dollar by larger, seemingly legitimate corporations just before they collapsed. Marcus, it seemed, had been a small-time predator, a jackal who picked off vulnerable individuals like Ellie, perhaps to feed information or create financial chaos that benefited these larger, unseen sharks. And R. Sterling. The name was an alias. Peterson suspected a cutout used by someone wanting to keep their hands impeccably clean. The closer they got to understanding the mechanism, the more dangerous it felt. Julian, for all his wealth and influence, felt a knot of apprehension. This wasn't a hostile takeover. This was something far uglier with the potential to touch lives in profoundly damaging ways. Ellie, too, felt the escalating tension, but with it came a steely resolve. She would not be a victim again. The information she held, the memories she was painstakingly piecing together with her therapist, were no longer just sources of pain, but potential keys. Serafina Marlowe, however, was orchestrating her own kind of hostile takeover. The annual Hayes Foundation charity ball was fast approaching an event Julian always chaired. It was the glittering pinnacle of the city's philanthropic calendar, and Serafina, still a prominent figure on the board, despite her and Julian's cooling relationship, knew it was the perfect stage. She'd gathered her ammunition, carefully selected out-of-context photos of Ellie from her darkest days on the streets, whispers from concerned sources about Ellie's instability, her questionable past. Her narrative was simple and poisonous. Julian, in his grief, or perhaps a midlife crisis, had been taken in by a cunning, damaged woman looking for a meal ticket. Sophia Hayes, Julian's astute younger sister, had noticed Serafina's machinations. Over a strained pre-gala family lunch, where Julian formally announced Ellie would be his guest, Sophia had watched Serafina offer saccharine words of support for Julian's charitable impulses toward Ellie. Later, alone with Julian, Sophia had remarked dryly, "Brother, dear Serafina's performance of saintly understanding was so convincing, I almost expected a halo to materialize. She's sharpening her claws for something. Be warned." Julian had appreciated his sister's candor, his own unease about Serafina's motives solidifying. He knew this evening would be a test. The ballroom glittered a sea of diamonds and designer gowns. Ellie, by Julian's side, looked beautiful if fragile, in a simple, elegant dress Julian had insisted on buying her. She moved with a quiet dignity that defied her recent past, but Julian could feel the tremor in her hand as he held it. He squeezed it reassuringly. "We're in this together," he murmured. The attack, when it came, was as public and vicious as Serafina could make it. During a lull in the speeches, as Julian was outlining the Foundation's new initiatives, Serafina requested the microphone ostensibly to make an additional pledge. Her voice, usually silken, now dripped with feigned concern that barely masked her malice. Before we continue, Serafina began, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on Ellie with laser focus. "I feel as a long-time friend of Julian and this foundation. It's my duty to address a matter of delicate concern." A hush fell over the ballroom. We all admire Julian's generosity, his compassion for the less fortunate. Her gaze was pure venom as it rested on Ellie. But sometimes, dear Julian, that compassion can be exploited. Sometimes the stories we are told are not the entire truth. Sometimes broken things simply cannot be mended and can in fact damage those who try. She then proceeded to paint a picture of Ellie as a disturbed, manipulative woman, hinting at a sordid history and questioning her motives for being with Julian. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. Ellie flinched, as if struck, her face paling, but she stood her ground, Julian's hand a vice grip in hers. The room was a vortex of whispers, shocked glances. Julian felt a cold rage build within him. But before he could speak, Ellie, her voice trembling but clear, stepped slightly forward. "Mrs. Marlowe," she began, her gaze meeting Serafina's unflinchingly. "You speak of stories. Let me tell you one. It's about a man named Marcus who charmed and defrauded. And it's about the people who might have enabled him, people who hide behind respectable fronts while profiting from misery." It was then that Julian stepped to the podium, a file in his hand, Peterson's latest damning report. "Serafina," his voice was dangerously calm, cutting through the stunned silence. "Your concern for my well-being is touching, but perhaps your energy would be better spent explaining your own connections." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out the facts, cold and precise. The shell company AP Import, Export, its brief lucrative existence, And then the bombshell Peterson had traced the primary beneficiary of AP Import-Export's final largest transaction, a transaction that coincided precisely with Marcus's disappearance and Ellie's complete financial ruin. The beneficiary was a holding company secretly owned by Serafina Marlowe. The gasp that swept the room was audible. Serafina's perfectly composed mask shattered. That's a lie. Preposterous, she stammered, her eyes darting around for an escape. Is it? Julian continued, his voice relentless. Because we also found Marcus. He's quite talkative now that he knows his silent, very powerful partner, R. Sterling, an alias you favored, I believe, was perfectly willing to let him take the fall for everything. He confirmed how AP Import-Export was used to launder funds from businesses you acquired, under duress often after individuals like Ellie were systematically ruined by your associate Marcus to drive down their value. The twist was brutal, unexpected. Serafina wasn't just a jealous ex. She was a predator implicated in the very scheme that had destroyed Ellie's life, a scheme far more extensive and ruthless than simple con artistry. Her campaign against Ellie wasn't just to win Julian back. It was to silence someone who, if she ever regained her footing, and her memory might hold a key to exposing her. Ellie stared at Serafina, comprehension dawning a mix of horror and a strange, terrible vindication. The woman who had just tried to publicly annihilate her was an architect of her past ruin. You, Ellie whispered, her voice shaking not with fear, but with a nascent, righteous anger. It was you all along. Serafina stood exposed, her empire of deceit crumbling around her in the glittering ballroom. The whispers now were not of Ellie's past, but of Serafina's treachery. Mr. Hayes. Julian's father watched from his table, his expression grim but resolute. Sophia looked at her brother, and then at Ellie, a newfound respect mingled with fury at Serafina in her eyes. The evening that was meant to be Serafina's triumph had become her public execution. The beautiful facade had fallen, revealing something ugly and rotten beneath. And in its place, against all odds, stood Eleanor Vance, no longer a beggar in the shadows, but a woman whose truth, however painful, was finally seeing the light. The fight was far from over, Julian knew, but tonight a significant battle had been won. The investigator Julian had hired, a meticulous former financial fraud detective named Peterson, was like a bloodhound on a cold trail. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to unravel the tangled threads of AP Import-Export and the elusive R. Sterling. The company was a ghost, a series of post office boxes and shell corporations that snaked through offshore havens. But Peterson found a pattern. Its brief, profitable activities often coincided with a string of failed businesses whose assets were mysteriously acquired for pennies on the dollar by larger, seemingly legitimate corporations just before they collapsed. Marcus, it seemed, had been a small-time predator, a jackal who picked off vulnerable individuals like Ellie, perhaps to feed information or create financial chaos that benefited these larger, unseen sharks. And R. Sterling. The name was an alias Peterson suspected, a cutout used by someone wanting to keep their hands impeccably clean. The closer they got to understanding the mechanism, the more dangerous it felt. Julian, for all his wealth and influence, felt a knot of apprehension. This wasn't a hostile takeover. This was something far uglier, with the potential to touch lives in profoundly damaging ways. Ellie, too, felt the escalating tension, but with it came a steely resolve. She would not be a victim again. The information she held, the memories she was painstakingly piecing together with her therapist, were no longer just sources of pain, but potential keys. Serafina Marlowe, however, was orchestrating her own kind of hostile takeover. The annual Hayes Foundation charity ball was fast approaching an event Julian always chaired. It was the glittering pinnacle of the city's philanthropic calendar, and Seraphina, still a prominent figure on the board, despite her and Julian's cooling relationship, knew it was the perfect stage. She'd gathered her ammunition, carefully selected out-of-context photos of Ellie from her darkest days on the streets, whispers from concerned sources about Ellie's instability, her questionable past. Her narrative was simple and poisonous. Julian, in his grief or perhaps a midlife crisis, had been taken in by a cunning, damaged woman looking for a meal ticket. Sophia Hayes, Julian's astute younger sister, had noticed Seraphina's machinations. Over a strained pre-gala family lunch, where Julian formally announced Ellie would be his guest, Sophia had watched Seraphina offer saccharine words of support for Julian's charitable impulses toward Ellie. Later, alone with Julian, Sophia had remarked dryly, "Brother, dear Seraphina's performance of saintly understanding was so convincing, I almost expected a halo to materialize. She's sharpening her claws for something. Be warned." Julian had appreciated his sister's candor, his own unease about Seraphina's motives solidifying. He knew this evening would be a test. The ballroom glittered a sea of diamonds and designer gowns. Ellie, by Julian's side, looked beautiful if fragile, in a simple, elegant dress Julian had insisted on buying her. She moved with a quiet dignity that defied her recent past, but Julian could feel the tremor in her hand as he held it. He squeezed it reassuringly. "We're in this together," he murmured. The attack, when it came, was as public and vicious as Seraphina could make it. During a lull in the speeches, as Julian was outlining the Foundation's new initiatives, Seraphina requested the microphone ostensibly to make an additional pledge. Her voice, usually silken, now dripped with feigned concern that barely masked her malice. "Before we continue," Seraphina began, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on Ellie with laser focus. "I feel as a long-time friend of Julian and this foundation, it's my duty to address a matter of delicate concern." A hush fell over the ballroom. We all admire Julian's generosity, his compassion for the less fortunate. Her gaze was pure venom as it rested on Ellie. But sometimes, dear Julian, that compassion can be exploited. Sometimes the stories we are told are not the entire truth. Sometimes broken things simply cannot be mended and can in fact damage those who try. She then proceeded to paint a picture of Ellie as a disturbed, manipulative woman, hinting at a sordid history and questioning her motives for being with Julian. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. Ellie flinched, as if struck, her face paling, but she stood her ground, Julian's hand a vice grip in hers. The room was a vortex of whispers, shocked glances. Julian felt a cold rage build within him. But before he could speak, Ellie, her voice trembling but clear, stepped slightly forward. "Mrs. Marlowe," she began, her gaze meeting Seraphina's unflinchingly. "You speak of stories. Let me tell you one. It's about a man named Marcus who charmed and defrauded. And it's about the people who might have enabled him, people who hide behind respectable fronts while profiting from misery." It was then that Julian stepped to the podium, a file in his hand, Peterson's latest damning report. Seraphina, his voice was dangerously calm, cutting through the stunned silence. "Your concern for my well-being is touching, but perhaps your energy would be better spent explaining your own connections." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He laid out the facts, cold and precise. The shell company AP Import-Export, its brief lucrative existence. And then the bombshell Peterson had traced the primary beneficiary of AP Import-Export's final largest transaction, a transaction that coincided precisely with Marcus's disappearance and Ellie's complete financial ruin. The beneficiary was a holding company secretly owned by Serafina Marlowe. The gasp that swept the room was audible. Serafina's perfectly composed mask shattered. That's a lie. Preposterous. She stammered, her eyes darting around for an escape. Is it? Julian continued, his voice relentless. Because we also found Marcus. He's quite talkative now that he knows his silent, very powerful partner, R. Sterling, an alias you favored, I believe, was perfectly willing to let him take the fall for everything. He confirmed how AP Import-Export was used to launder funds from businesses you acquired, under duress often after individuals like Ellie were systematically ruined by your associate Marcus to drive down their value. The twist was brutal, unexpected. Serafina wasn't just a jealous ex. She was a predator, implicated in the very scheme that had destroyed Ellie's life, a scheme far more extensive and ruthless than simple con artistry. Her campaign against Ellie wasn't just to win Julian back. It was to silence someone who, if she ever regained her footing, and her memory might hold a key to exposing her. Ellie stared at Serafina, comprehension, dawning a mix of horror and a strange, terrible vindication. The woman who had just tried to publicly annihilate her was an architect of her past ruin. You, Ellie whispered, her voice shaking not with fear, but with a nascent, righteous anger. It was you all along. Serafina stood, exposed, her empire of deceit crumbling around her in the glittering ballroom. The whispers now were not of Ellie's past, but of Serafina's treachery. Mr. Hayes, Julian's father, watched from his table, his expression grim but resolute. Sophia looked at her brother, and then at Ellie, a newfound respect mingled with fury at Serafina in her eyes. The evening that was meant to be Serafina's triumph had become her public execution. The beautiful facade had fallen, revealing something ugly and rotten beneath. And in its place, against all odds, stood Eleanor Vance, no longer a beggar in the shadows, but a woman whose truth, however painful, was finally seeing the light. The fight was far from over, Julian knew, but tonight a significant battle had been won. The fallout from the Hayes Foundation charity ball was swift and merciless, at least for Serafina Marlowe. The whispers that had once targeted Ellie now swirled around Serafina, magnified by the irrefutable evidence Julian had presented. Embezzlement, fraud, criminal conspiracy. A cascade of ugly words attached themselves to her name. Investigations were launched, assets frozen. Her carefully constructed world of influence and deceit imploded with spectacular speed. Marcus, her erstwhile pawn, had indeed become quite talkative, with authorities eager to lessen his own culpability by exposing the full extent of Serafina's operations. Justice, it seemed, had finally awoken from a long slumber. But for Eleanor Vance, the immediate aftermath was a confusing maelstrom of emotions. The public vindication was a strange, hollow victory when weighed against the brutal re-exposure of her deepest wounds. The ordeal at the gala had been like ripping off a barely healed scab, leaving her raw and vulnerable all over again. She retreated into the quiet sanctuary. Julian provided the silence of his vast apartment, both a comfort and a container for the storm raging within her. Her therapy sessions intensified. Dr. Ramirez, her therapist, guided her gently but firmly through the labyrinth of shame and self-blame that still clung to her like shadows. You survived, Eleanor, Dr. Ramirez would often say. You made choices to stay alive in an impossible situation. Those choices don't define your worth. They define your strength. But the words were hard to internalize. Ellie would lie awake at night, the faces of the gala attendees swimming in her vision. Serafina's venomous accusations echoing in her ears, mingling with the older, deeper shames Marcus had instilled. Was I foolish weak, she'd whisper into the darkness. Could I have done something differently? Am I truly worthy of this? Of Julian, with an almost saintly patience never pushed. He was simply there, a steadfast presence, offering a quiet cup of tea, a shared silence, watching the city lights, or a hand to hold when the nightmares came too close. He spoke of his unwavering belief in her not as a broken thing he was fixing, but as the remarkable woman he had always known, a woman who had weathered an unimaginable storm and was day by day finding her way back to shore. His love was a gentle tide, slowly washing away the ingrained belief that she was somehow irrevocably tainted. Sophia Hayes became an unexpected ally. A few days after the gala, she appeared at Julian's apartment, a peace offering of freshly baked scones in her hands and a contrite expression on her face. Ellie, she began her usual breezy confidence, tempered with genuine remorse. I was an idiot. A snob. I judged you without knowing a fraction of your story, and I am so sorry. Ellie, surprised by the visit, offered a small, hesitant smile. Thank you, Sophia. That means a lot. Sophia settled onto the sofa, her gaze direct. Julian, you know, she said, turning to her brother with a teasing glint in her eye, for a man who can spot a fraudulent business dealing from a mile away. You were surprisingly blind to Serafina's particular brand of toxicity for years. Good thing Ellie came along to open your eyes. Though I must admit, your projects do keep life interesting around here. This one just happens to be the most worthwhile. She winked at Ellie, and a fragile bridge of camaraderie was built. Even Isabel Isa Moreno, Julian's warm, no-nonsense housekeeper, offered her own brand of quiet support. One afternoon, finding Ellie staring pensively out the window, Isa had placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Señorita Ellie, she'd said, her voice rich with a lifetime of wisdom. Life, she is a stubborn mule. No, she kicks you when you are down. But you are a strong woman. You kick her back, but with kindness, you show her. Besides, Isa had added a twinkle in her eye. Mr. Julian, he has not smiled this much. A real smile from the heart in many years. It is good to see. Love, it is the best medicine, no better than all my old grandmother's strange teas. And that is saying something. Ellie had found herself laughing a genuine laugh that eased some of the tightness in her chest. News of Serafina's downfall continued to filter in. Her assets were seized, her reputation in tatters. Formal charges were being prepared. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing that justice was being served, but Ellie found it didn't bring her the peace she craved. That peace, she was beginning to understand, had to come from within. The turning point arrived not in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet moment of introspection during a therapy session. Dr. Ramirez had gently guided her back to the core of her lingering guilt, not for what Marcus or Serafina had done to her, but for her own perceived failures, for not being smarter, stronger, for somehow allowing it all to happen. Eleanor, Dr. Ramirez said softly, if a child stumbles and falls, do you blame the child for not being more agile, or do you help them up, tend to their scrapes, and encourage them to try again? The simple analogy resonated deep within Ellie. She had been that child metaphorically, and she had been blaming herself for the fall instead of acknowledging the treacherous ground she'd been forced to walk upon. That evening she found Julian on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. She stood beside him, a newfound quietude about her. Julian, she said, her voice steady, thank you. He turned his eyes, questioning. For what, Ellie? For seeing me, she said simply, when I couldn't even see myself. For believing in me, even when I was a stranger to my own strength. She took a deep breath. I think I think I'm starting to believe too. Not that the scars will ever fully disappear, but that they don't have to define who I am or who I can become. It wasn't a declaration of complete healing, not yet. But it was a choice, a conscious, difficult choice to step out of the shadows of victimhood and into the light of her own agency. It was the first true dawn of her earned peace. Julian's heart swelled. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the city lights began to sprinkle across the darkening expanse below. The road ahead was still long, but now he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, they would walk it together, not as a rescuer and a rescued, but as two souls who had found their way back to each other, ready to face whatever came next. The months that followed were a quiet symphony of rebuilding, not just for Ellie but for Julian too, with the spectre of Serafina Marlowe and her machinations receding into a well-deserved oblivion of legal battles and social disgrace. A space opened up for something new, something authentic to grow. Ellie, with Julian's unwavering support and the seed money from the Hayes Foundation, poured her heart into establishing a small but ambitious outreach center for women and children who had faced homelessness and trauma. She named it the Eleanor Vance Initiative for Second Chances, a testament to her own journey. It wasn't just about providing shelter. It was about restoring dignity, offering counseling, job training, and a community of support. Her past pain, once a source of shame, became her greatest strength, allowing her to connect with those she helped with a profound empathy that no amount of professional training could replicate. Julian often found her there, sleeves rolled up a smudge of paint on her cheek, her laughter echoing in the brightly painted rooms, a sound more precious to him than any stock market rally. Julian, in turn, discovered a different kind of wealth. The boardroom still demanded his attention, but his true fulfillment now lay in the quiet evenings with Ellie, in the shared purpose of their foundation work in witnessing her extraordinary resilience blossom into leadership. He found himself, much to his own surprise, attempting domesticity. One Saturday morning, armed with an online tutorial and a misplaced sense of confidence, he'd tried to fix a stubbornly dripping faucet in Ellie's modest apartment, which she insisted on keeping a symbol of her hard-won independence. The endeavor had resulted in a minor geyser, a drenched Julian and Ellie leaning against the doorframe, tears of laughter streaming down her face. Julian Hayes. She'd gasped, trying to catch her breath. The man who can orchestrate billion-dollar mergers finally defeated by basic plumbing. Perhaps some battles are best left to the professionals. He'd looked at his soaked shirt, the triumphant gurgle of the still-dripping faucet, and joined her laughter, a carefree sound that had been absent from his life for too long. All right, Miss Vance," he'd conceded, mock surrendering with raised hands. "I'll stick to philanthropy. My talents clearly don't extend to aquatic engineering." These moments of shared simple joy were the new currency of his happiness. Their love, rekindled from the embers of a childhood memory and forged in the crucible of shared adversity, deepened into a partnership of profound respect and unwavering devotion. One crisp autumn evening, as they walked hand in hand through Central Park, the leaves a carpet of gold and crimson, beneath their feet Julian stopped by the Gapstow Bridge, the city skyline a glittering backdrop. He turned to Ellie, his eyes reflecting the myriad lights. "Eleanor Vance," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You walked out of the darkest night and brought more light into my life than I ever thought possible. You've not only saved yourself with a courage that leaves me in awe every single day, but you've saved me too, from a life that was full, yet somehow empty." He knelt not with the flourish of a grand romantic gesture, but with the humble sincerity of a man bearing his soul. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. "You are my best friend, my greatest inspiration, the love of my life then and now. Ellie, will you marry me? Will you build this next chapter with me?" Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, tears of joy, of disbelief, of a happiness so profound it felt sacred. "Oh, Julian," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the simple, elegant diamond onto her finger, a symbol not of ownership, but of an unbreakable bond. Their wedding a few months later was an intimate affair held in the sun-dappled garden of Julian's country estate. Sophia Hayes, Ellie's staunchest supporter, and now beloved sister-in-law, was the maid of honor, occasionally dabbing her eyes and making witty asides about finally having a sister to conspire with against Julian. Daniel Walker, as best man, gave a speech that was both deeply heartfelt and hilariously punctuated with anecdotes about Julian's pre-Ellie era of existential brooding, much to Julian's mock chagrin and everyone else's amusement. Mr. Hayes watched his gruff exterior softened by a proud, warm smile. Even Isabel Isa Moreno was there, beaming like a proud godmother, muttering in Spanish about angels finally finding their way. It was a celebration of earned peace of love, rediscovered and rebuilt. There were no grand pronouncements to the press, no ostentatious displays. Just genuine joy, shared with those who had witnessed their journey, who understood the depth of the scars they both carried and the incredible strength it had taken to heal. Life settled into a new, meaningful rhythm. The Eleanor Vance Initiative flourished, expanding its reach, becoming a beacon of hope for countless others. Julian found that his business acumen, once solely dedicated to profit, could be a powerful force for social good when aligned with Ellie's passion. They worked side by side, their partnership, a seamless blend of his strategic mind and her compassionate heart. The memories of the darkness didn't vanish entirely. They remained not as haunting ghosts, but as reminders of their resilience, of the preciousness of second chances. They were a part of their story, the story of how a millionaire saw a woman lost in the shadows, recognized the soulmate he'd thought long gone, and how together, through courage, love, and an unwavering belief in each other, they had not only saved her, but had built a life so rich in purpose and joy that indeed no one who knew their separate beginnings could ever have believed it possible. Their love, once a tender whisper from the past, now resonated as a powerful, enduring song of hope, echoing far beyond their own lives, touching all those who were ready to believe in the extraordinary power of a new beginning. And so Julian and Ellie's journey, which began with a flicker of recognition in a desolate doorway, blossomed into a lifetime of shared purpose and profound love. Their story reminds us that even from the deepest despair, hope can be rekindled, and that the most beautiful connections are often forged in the fires of adversity. How often, perhaps, do we pass by a life whose silent battles we cannot see or underestimate the incredible strength hidden beneath the scars of the past? Their path from a rainy street to a shared future filled with healing and a commitment to uplifting others truly touches the heart. If their journey resonated with you, we would be so grateful to hear your thoughts. What part of Eleanor's path to self-forgiveness and finding her voice struck the deepest chord with you? Or what did Julian's unwavering support truly signify in your eyes? We pour our hearts into bringing these narratives to life, and your perspective is incredibly valuable to us. If you have any reflections on today's story, or ideas on how we can make future tales even more resonant and meaningful, please do share them in the comments below. Your feedback helps us grow and craft better experiences for all of you. If Julian and Ellie's story of resilience, love and second chances moved you, would mean so much. And if you believe their journey could offer a little hope or comfort to someone else, please consider sharing it. For more stories that delve into the human spirit and the enduring power of connection, do subscribe and click the notification bell. We'd love for you to join our community as we continue to explore these inspiring paths together. Until we meet again in our next story, may you always look for the light in others and be the light for someone when they need it most. Take care.